Clair Obscur starts with one of the strongest prologues I have ever experienced in a game. The gommage is such a cool concept. It creates the foundation of a fascinating world and allows the game to explore the impact of death on those left behind. The game world is fantastic, the characters are amazing, the exploration of emotions deep. At the very least it is in the first part of the game. But as the game draws towards its end, I find that the game fails to keep the same quality of depth and complexity that is for me the main quality that makes the prologue and early parts of Clair Obscur so good.
Thanks.
If you continue watching, I will spoil the entire game for you. I'm going to discuss the narrative design of the game, which means I need to spoil it. Starting with the end footage right now. You have been warned. Act 3 sacrifices the world that has been so carefully built to attempt to force grief down the player's throat. I have 3 major problems with the narrative of Act 3. My first problem is that the real world lacks world building, which is important to ground the story. Secondly, the family of gods that rule over the canvas are not well enough explored outside of the canvas, which means that their motivation and history are hard to grasp. Thirdly, the world of Luminaire and its characters are discarded like trash. The real world is the only one that has any value. The fake world within the canvas is worthless. These 3 issues means that I find it hard to connect to the family of gods, because I don't understand where they are coming from. Just to be clear, the story in Act 3 and the ending are by no means bad. It is still possible to have an amazing experience, but it lacks the same depth and complexity as the previous acts. I will come back to Act 3 later, and my problems with it. First, I want to talk about the narrative design of the prologue, Act 1 and Act 2, which are all phenomenally well crafted. The world of Clair Obscur is focused on the themes of sorrow, grief, death and life, and the exploration of these emotions. In order to explore emotions, you need good characters. To have good characters, the world they inhabit need to feel real. This is always true, regardless of the story. The gommage is front and center to the existence of the characters in this world. Once every year, everyone above a certain age dies, and a number on the monolith counts down by 1 towards extinction. When the game begins, that number is about to turn from 34 to 33, and this countdown has been going on for 67 years. The next generation is the last one, and time is running out. The concept of the gommage is a fantastic foundation to build a story on, which allows excellent exploration of the themes of grief, sorrow and death. This relatively simple concept has a lot of consequences that reach deep for the world and its characters. Every person in this world lives with a loaded gun pointed at them at all times, and they know when it will end their lives. They know when everyone they know and love are going to die. This knowledge changes how a society works and how persons think and interact with the world. Knowing when everyone is going to die has so many implications. For example, you can math out when your potential child will die. On top of knowing when they are going to die, they know that extinction is close. They know that everyone will be dead in 33 years. That just adds to the hopelessness. They can't adapt to the knowledge of a shorter life. They can't hope for the future. There is none as long as the gommage continues. This society and every character in it is bombarded by death and grief. It never stops. Your parents die, your mentors die, your comrades die, your partner dies, everyone always die, all of the time. It never stops. Every single individual in this world knows grief and death intimately. Great writing and execution is what turns the gommage from a great concept to a realized story with impact. The characters behave realistically. If you put a real person into this world, they will probably behave in a similar way, and that is what characterizes great writing. Every character's actions make sense given the world they live in and the character's experiences and personality. On top of great writing, characters are well animated. Body language and facial gestures support the writing. Music and art direction sets the tone, atmosphere, and pulls on the player's emotional strings. I hope that the background footage with its music and art managed to provoke some feelings in you, which is a great example of the power of music and art. In a desperate attempt to save the world, their loved ones and themselves from the Gommage, expeditions are created. Expeditions to the continent with the goal of killing the paintress and ending the Gommage. These expeditions also create hope in an otherwise bleak world. Everyone knows that it's hopeless though, but it is something to cling to. It is a last act of desperation and defiance. The expedition explores the unknown continent. It is filled with countless mysteries. And there are so many questions we as players want answers to. For example, who is the paintress? Why is she killing everyone? And what happened to all of the previous expeditions? We discover the fate of previous expeditions through journals, what they did and how they died. Journals are a great way to reveal parts of a mystery, to drip feed the player with a small amount of information at a time. It allows the player to learn about the fate of the expeditions in any order. The journals provide world building, but they also explore the characters and emotions of previous expeditions. Non-linear storytelling such as this is one of the biggest strengths a game can use as a storytelling device, and is unique to games as a medium. The journals are connected to the bizarre and weird continent and the world as a whole. This world is unpredictable, which makes it impossible to predict what you will run into. Gameplay is the primary way this story is told. We know some about the world from cutscenes and journals, but gameplay is really where you feel it. You run around the levels and the world map, discovering journals, odd environments and structures, combat equipment and so forth. There is so much to explore, and the gameplay is really important in reinforcing the feeling of being part of an expedition into the unknown. Combat also reinforces how dangerous and lethal the continent is. Tons of powerful monsters at every corner are trying to cut the expedition down. If you're engaged by the combat and exploration, that is a bonus. If you like the combat or not, that is of course subjective, but as a narrative device, it works. It should be difficult in order to work though. If the game is too easy, the player won't get the feeling that the continent is dangerous, which would not work with the story. The Decedra family is a key part of the game. Renoir is the first person we meet, and we meet him as the old man on the beach that effortlessly slaughters most of the expedition. This is the start of the mystery of the Decedra family. Who is this white-haired man? Why did he slaughter everyone? How is he alive when he is so old? How did he survive the Gommage? This is yet another layer to the mystery of this world that also explores the theme of grief. I think it is fair to say that the narrative of Clair Obscur is unpredictable, but that it still makes sense. It is great because the narrative can usually take several paths at a big moment. The story is not forced into a single direction to maintain a coherent and functional story. This is what you might call narrative branching. The story has a lot of different branches or paths it can take and still work. This is why Game of Thrones is so good, because every character can die and the story still continues on and still works. If a character dies, the story can pivot to another character. The story does not rely on a single character to be the conduit for the entire story for the entire duration that it is being told. Let us use Gustav as an example of when the story has a few good branches and when it has many strong ones. Initially, Gustav carries the burden of the story on his back, and he has a significant amount of plot armor in the early game. After the painted version of Renoir murders most of the expedition, Gustav stumbles about into a massacre of the previous expedition. This is, first and foremost, a great exploration in how someone might deal with intense loss, stress and hopelessness. Gustav breaks down, summons a pistol and slowly puts it against his head, preparing to pull the trigger to end his life. This makes a ton of sense based on both Gustav's character and the events that lead up to it. But the narrative has a high preference to keep Gustav alive. It is much easier to use Gustav as a protagonist to introduce the world and the remainder of the cast instead of killing off the only protagonist you have and putting that burden on Luné instead. We know Gustav as a character so much more than we know Luné at this point. You would essentially have sacrificed the prologue in terms of character building to create the effect that everyone can die and to showcase how different people deal with the horrible situation and that someone actually does break. It is possible to kill Gustav here, but the narrative prefers to keep him alive from the time being. While there are possible branches in the narrative, there is a very clear preference for which path or which branch the story wants to take. But when Gustav has served his main purpose, which is to introduce the world and the main cast, he can die. His plot armor is long gone. And the same is really true for both Luné and Ciel. They can die and the story still moves forward without them. If any of them die, another character can take over the role of a protagonist without having to re-establish new characters. We already know them. And when the squad is faced with an extreme obstacle with the return of the white-haired man, Gustav more or less sacrifices himself and dies. At this point in the story, Gustav can live and he can die. If he lives, the story continues as it has up until this point. Maybe they get away with major injuries and need to find a way to heal Gustav. Gustav might slowly die from injuries after the battle, but survive the initial encounter. All of these options are real branches the narrative can follow. It becomes a different story of course, but all of these stories works based on the setup. Gustav of course dies, which serves a different purpose. The purpose of Gustav's death is to hit the characters with a punch. Force them to deal with more death. Force them to deal with more grief. And show how they move forward. Maëlle is the youngest in the party, and she is destroyed by Gustav's death, initially crying heavily while being comforted by Esqui. That later turns into rage and anger with a desire for vengeance. Luné and Ciel are on the other hand relatively calm about it. Lune tries to cope with it by focusing on the plan and what they need to do. Ciel has the mentality that tomorrow will still come and accepts what the world is at any given moment more readily than the rest of the party. Gustav's death stays with them for the rest of the story, of course, as they continue to grieve. But it's not only the characters in the game that grieve for Gustav, the players might also feel a sense of loss when he dies. If they are engaged by the gameplay and the story, this death probably hits pretty hard for a lot of players, which is of course the intention, to make the player grieve with the character and feel a sense of loss. Gustav's death is just one example of grief, but I think that this highlights how complex and deep the game manages to reach when it deals with this theme. Grief is the shining star of Clair Obscur. You have example after example we could go through to discuss how grief is handled and how well it is done. But the narrative doesn't drown in grief. There is still hope for the future and those that come after. Grief is a heavy theme, and it is important to have palate cleansers to keep players from being overwhelmed and desensitized by it. Guest roles are one of the main sources of this in Clair Obscur, and let's use their village as an example. And the entire village is an expression of childlike chaos and joy. The entire atmosphere is much lighter than the rest of the game, and it lowers your guard when you interact with things in this sort of environment. Small things like the art style of the signs, which are similar to what a child would have in their treehouse, creates this sort of light and merry environment. The use of colors. The random chaotic organization of the entire village. Every little detail helps to create this environment that resets the player's emotions, providing a break from the grief. Gameplay can also be decent at removing the player from the intense emotion of the story. but they can also help to reinforce the story and the theme of grief. It is a bit dependent on where you are in the journey and how hard you connect with the story and the combat. Sometimes combat removes your mind from the grief because you're focused on the combat, but other times combat gives you time to think about the grief. It depends a lot on the environment, the combat encounter and the individual player and where you are in your journey. Characters like Esqui and Monaco is probably the most consistent way that the game provides relief from grief and death though, as they are part of the party at all times after a certain point. But in general, the game uses a lot of small palate cleansers that stops the player from disassociating with the story. And it is really important that the game has these palate cleansers to keep the narrative impact high throughout the story. As I said in the introduction of this video, I think that the Prologue, Act 1 and Act 2 tell great stories. I like it because there is so much depth to the world and the characters, and that is for me the secret to a great story. If you have the depth, you can create realistic portrayals of themes such as grief. It feels like every little detail is thought through and is built on the same foundation, which makes the story consistent. The world building is really what stands out to me, and the characters that are built on top of this world, and that again creates emotions that are raw and intense. The beginning of Act 3 reveals that the world we thought was real, or as real as game worlds come anyway, actually exists within another world. It is a canvas, a painting created by the Cedar family. I love this as a plot twist, I really do, but I do think that the game fails to understand and explore the consequences of this reveal properly. The game fails to properly set up the real world and the family. And don't get me wrong, Act 3 is by no means bad, and the ending does work, but it needed a lot more work to get there without the glaring cracks in the story. As I said in the introduction to this video, every story about emotions relies on characters, and characters rely on good world building. And I think the world building of the real world, in which the canvas exists, is abysmal. The world is set in Paris, but with the addition of magic based on painting. And while we don't need a complete and detailed description of how this magic works, we do need an understanding of the basic rules that governs the magic, and perhaps most importantly, what it actually allows the user to do and the cost related to that. We know that magic of the canvas takes something out of the user, but how much? How does it actually work? I want an example of someone that died due to being in a canvas for too long, and I want to know exactly how they died, how long it took, what their death looked like, and we need to know the actual consequences for the paintress and for Alicia or Maël. We don't, not really. We are told that they will die, but we don't know how long that will take or how that will happen, which is crucial information in order to sell the stakes of their deaths and their fate. Let's compare how different deaths can be within the canvas. Someday, your body just can't support itself anymore and just dies from exhaustion. Your mind then stops being in the painting, you just vanish from the world. Just like that, sudden and without warning, but the canvas still continues onwards. Alternatively, when you die, you are going to slowly go mad as your body tries to pull you back from the painting, and your mind is going to decay, and you will create havoc around you until the canvas and everything and everyone in it is destroyed before you slowly drown in an ocean of paint without meaning. I would say that one of these two fates is quite worse than the other ones, which influences greatly what we feel about death in the canvas and about the choices we make in the end. Then we have the rules of this magic. What does this magic actually create? Does it create neat little robots that do as they are programmed, who can act like they're human, but in reality they feel nothing? Or do the magic create life, with conscious, thinking and feeling beings? I think the answer is probably that they create life, and that is conscious, based on how Renoir talks to Verso. He treats Verso like an actual human being and not a painted illusion of one. This distinction between illusion of consciousness and actual consciousness is a huge theme, and it is an important distinction. You either turn off a computer program or you wipe out a world full of real people who think and feel. I'll come back to this world point later, but I want to finish my complaints about the Cedar family first. The first issue I have with the family of gods is that a lot of the story is about Verso, and we know next to nothing about the Verso that died. We know something about him as a child and what he created in the painting, and we know the Verso that his mother painted. But we don't really know anything about the real Verso in the adult form, who he was and his relation to the rest of the family. This is a pretty big fucking issue when the game revolves around grief for Verso. The fire that killed Verso also burned Alicia pretty severely, but we know next to nothing about the fire. Where was it? What was the cause of the fire? Verso saved Alicia, but is she actually justified in feeling guilty for his death? Is her mother justified in blaming her? Is Alicia actually to blame for the fire? The fire is just too vague, and being vague is okay if said thing is not central to the plot, but the fire is the foundation for the entire game. The fire therefore needs to be described in more detail to make the character's motivation and struggles feel more grounded. The only character in the family we know is Alicia and Renoir. The rest of them are just vague and undefined. And even Alicia is a bit vague, because we don't really understand how alone she is in the real world. Does she have friends? Does she have hobbies? Is she in pain? Does she go to school or work? Is she at home forever? How does people react when they see her face? We don't know. We can make assumptions about this, but assumptions is not good enough when these questions are a core part of Alicia's personal experience of the world. We need to know more about her in the real world to understand her at a truly deep level. Currently, our understanding is very shallow, as all we essentially know is that she does not want to be in the real world. But the true depth of those emotions are never really explored. Verso died in a fire and she got hurt badly is reason enough. And I don't really like that. It needs to have more. Renoir is really the only character in the family of gods that we can really emphasize with. He knows that his family will die in the canvas if they stay there, and he is willing to do whatever it takes to get them out. That is a simple motivation based on love for your family, and we don't really need much more knowledge than that to emphasize with him. In Act 3, we learned that the world of Luminaire and all of its characters are just part of a canvas, created by the paintress. Suddenly, the game treats Luminaire and his characters as fake trash though. And here we come back to the failure of world building. Is this world actually fake? Or is it a real world that exists within another world? If the world is in fact crafted, like a game world, we can conclude that the world just exists as a way to cope with the world. But if this is a real world with conscious characters, then it is for all intents and purposes a real world, just like our own. Let's explore both options. Assuming it is not real, the narrative needed to be very clear about that, because that makes the impact of Alicia not wanting to leave this fake world so much stronger. Everyone knows that it is fake. The people are not real, they are just illusions. Yet she chooses these illusions over real life. That would have been how strong her grief over losing herself and Verso to the fire. She would rather fade away in an illusion rather than try to get along with her life. I feel like this is the route the narrative is trying to tell the players in a lot of cases. But That also means that Verso's suffering is worthless, because he is just a fake illusion that does not have real emotions or thoughts. His opinion is worth less than dog shit. The real Verso's soul that keeps Canvas alive might suffer though, and ending it for him might be a real benefit for someone that is actually real. But I think that the game should have focused on the simulated Verso and not the child soul of Verso, which should maybe have been the point in the endgame if the game was fake or the world was fake. But provided the world is real, then Verso's suffering will have value. His desire to die is real. It should be considered. But then you also need to ask the questions. Should you sacrifice an entire world because one dude wants to die and can't? Should you sacrifice an entire world if your daughter and wife is going to die in it because they don't want to leave? I can see the choice being yes for Renault, but it is a hard sell for everyone else. And if it is real, is it moral to torture these people with the Gomage and Nevrons to save your family? If it is real, is it moral to paint canvases in the first place? Then you have the question of what is really real, what is fake. Is the world real even if it exists within a canvas? I think the answer is yes to that. And we can apply this logic to our own world as well. We might live in a simulation and not realize it. You have so many morality questions that arises when you have a family that play God like this. You have so many philosophical questions about existence, which fits well with the theme of grief and death. But the game never even tries to highlight or play with these themes. And I find it a shame that it did not even try to make people think about these thoughts.
Why did you run in?
To make this worse, Ciel and Loon react as if they were told that Verso had burned down their favorite diner. Where is their fucking existential crisis? Where are their questions? Everything that the Prologue, Act 1 and Act 2 has built in terms of world building and fantastic characters are cast aside if they are trash. Their writing no longer matters. Both Luna's and Ciel's world is just trash, and they should react accordingly. It feels like the narrative is unsure if it wants the canvas to be fake or real, and leaves that up for the player to decide. But that does not work. You have to decide what the rules of your world is for this story to work at a deep level. I think a lot of people fill in these gaps with assumptions without thinking too much about this or realizing that they are filling in these gaps, and the story still works because of that. But for people like me that can't help go deeper, this doesn't work. I just get angry at the inconsistencies. The game would have benefited immensely from focusing on either this is real or this is fake. I think the narrative wants the player to realize that the world is fake, to realize that the world they have spent so long in does not matter, that the characters they have grown to love is worthless trash, to provoke feelings of grief of a world lost alongside its character. That I think is clearly the intent with the reveal and how it is done, but again, they have failed to commit to this fake world approach. In the end, I think this ends up sacrificing the amazing world they've built for nothing. The narrative is good as a whole, but there are some clear weaknesses and cracks in the last act. There is of course a lot of things I've not talked about here for the sake of keeping this video relatively focused and sort of short. But I hope that you found some of these thoughts interesting, and do leave a comment if you have some opinions on what I've discussed here. Some end notes on this video. I'm very much in the process of figuring out how I want to do these types of videos on specific games and how I want to present the information. In this video I've tried to keep the number of cuts to a minimum and focus on having footage that is related to what I'm talking about, but I've not used a lot of other visual tools to communicate my thoughts. Leave a comment if you have some thoughts on what worked well for you and what you did not like. Thank you for watching.